some systems need to be fail operational. And by that I mean they need to keep going even though a hardware component has broken. The next pattern is Low SIL Fail Operational. And the idea for this is that if you have a low safety integrity level, you can install a second CPU so that if the first CPU breaks, there's a second CPU available to take over the load. This is a 2-channel failover or 1 of 2 architecture. And what that means is that only one out of the 2 CPUs needs to work for the system to be operational. The pattern is there's a primary CPU and it runs all the time. However, if it fails, the system switches over to a backup or hot standby CPU. The software pattern is both systems run the same software and there's no isolation between them because the point of redundancy in this case is to provide higher availability. The pros for this pattern is that it is the simplest high availability pattern. If one CPU fails, the next one just takes over. And for simple failure modes, low SIL systems, the failover works pretty well. This pattern is commonly implemented with something like a heartbeat arrangement. So the primary system will send a periodic message to the standby system, and if the message goes away, the standby system will assume that the primary system has failed and will take over operation. The standby is called a hot standby because it's in operation all the time and tracks all the state that's going on inside the primary system. That way it's ready to take over at a moment's notice. There are a number of variations on this, such as a cold standby that takes a while to warm up before the changeover can occur, but those are all basic variations on the theme of there's a primary and a standby. The con for this pattern is that, as with the previous patterns, all software has to be promoted to the higher SIL. Because the redundancy is not here for isolation, the redundancy is here so that if one system fails, another can take over. This pattern requires standby diagnosis. There are a couple things that can go wrong. The first is the primary system can fail in a way that the heartbeat is the only thing left that's working and the rest has failed, and the standby won't know to take over. The other thing that can happen is the standby might fail, and the primary might have no way of knowing that happened. There are a couple ways to deal with this. One is the standby also sends a heartbeat to the primary, so the primary can set an alarm if the standby has failed. Another way is that every once in a while, say once a day, the primary and the standby can swap roles so that you can be sure both of them worked at least in the last day. The most important thing with this pattern to understand is that the standby component is not there to improve the safety of the system. What it does is it improves the availability. And here's the difference. The primary system and the standby are exact copies of each other. So if the primary system makes a mistake, the standby would have made the same mistake. What the redundancy does do, however, is that if the primary is at, say, SIL 2, and the standby is also at SIL 2, if the primary fails in a benign way, the standby can provide continued operation. So that might improve safety at some point, but it doesn't serve to increase the safety up to life-critical levels because there's always the possibility that the primary basically lied about whether it was working or not. So this pattern provides redundancy for availability. It does not provide redundancy to help with fault detection. We'll come to that later.